Colonies to Country, page 69. One if by land, two if by sea. 3 men rode horseback on an April night in 1775. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott. Each carried the same message: the redcoats are coming. You may have heard of Paul Revere because a poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, wrote a famous poem about his ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. Did you hear that Longfellow makes his words gallop like horses' hooves? If you read the story of Paul Revere in prose, you can compare it to the poet's version. Here it is. The Patriots were worried. It looked as if war with Britain couldn't be avoided. The Patriots were the colonists who wanted independence. They wanted to be free of British rule. The other colonists, the ones who wanted to stay British subjects, were called loyalists. Some patriots, like Samuel Adams, expected war, but most patriots still hoped to find peaceful ways to settle their differences with England. It was scary to think of war. England was a great power. The colonies were scattered and had little military experience. Still, it made sense to be prepared for the worst. So New Englanders began to stockpile cannonballs and gunpowder. They piled them up in Concord, a small town about 20 miles northwest of Boston. When the British officers heard about those munitions, they decided to get them. Paul Revere and his Boston friends learned of the British plans. They found out that the redcoats were going to march on Concord the next morning. Besides the gunpowder, Revere was worried about his friends, Sam Adams and John Hancock. They were hiding in Lexington, right next door to Concord. The British were searching for those 2 troublemakers, and they wanted to hang them as traitors. Someone had to get a warning to those towns, and fast. It would help to know which way the redcoats would march. Would they go the long route over the Boston Neck, or would they take the shorter route by boat across the water to Charlestown and then on foot from there? Billy Dawes didn't wait to find out. He pretended to be a drunk farmer and staggered past the British sentry who stood guard at the neck. As soon as he was out of sight of the guard, Dawes jumped on a horse and went at a gallop. He knew the redcoats would start out soon, and he shouted that message at each Patriot house he passed. That same night, Paul Revere sent someone to spy on the British. Find out which way the redcoats will march, the spy was told. Then climb to the high bell tower of the North Church and send a signal. Light 1 lantern if they go by land. Hang 2 lanterns if they go by sea. Revere got in a boat and quietly rowed out to the Charles River. A horse was ready for him on the Charlestown shore. He waited silently. Revere was a known patriot and would have been arrested if the British had found him outdoors at night. Here's more of the poem. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. Now he knew. The redcoats would take the water route across the Charles River just as Paul Revere was doing. What happened next? Well, both Billy Dawes and Paul Revere rode hard through the night, warning everyone in the countryside that the British were coming. They met at Lexington in time to tell Sam Adams and John Hancock to escape. But before they could go on to Concord, they were stopped by a British patrol. The redcoats took their horses. Luckily, by this time, a third man, Dr. Samuel Prescott, was riding with Dawes and Revere. Prescott had been visiting the girl he intended to marry in Lexington. The doctor managed to escape from the British, ride home to Concord, and warn everyone there. The American farmers were ready, and they grabbed their guns. They were called Minutemen because they could fight on a minute's notice. Some had been trained fighting in the French and Indian Wars. Captain John Parker was the leader of the Minutemen, and what he said on that day is now carved in stone near the spot where he must have stood. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And it did begin right there at Lexington. Each side says the other fired the first shot. No one knows who really did, but a poet named Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the shot heard round the world. Can you see why? When the smoke cleared, 8 American farmers lay dead. It was April 19th, 1775. The American Revolution had begun. But it was gunpowder that the redcoats had set out to get, so they marched on to Concord, but they couldn't find the powder. That made them angry, so they started a fire. "Will you let them burn the town down?" shouted one colonist. "No, I haven't a man who is afraid to go," said the Minutemen's Captain Isaac Davis. The British stood at the North Bridge in Concord. They fired at the colonists. The Minutemen fired back. Now the British were scared, and they tried to retreat. The Americans followed and whipped the redcoats. More than 2 Englishmen fell for every American casualty. Do you know the song Yankee Doodle? Well, the British made it up to insult the Americans. They said a Yankee Doodle was a backwards hick who didn't know how to fight. When the British marched to Concord and Lexington, they wore their fancy red uniforms, and their drummers and pipers played Yankee Doodle. After the battle, it was the Americans who sang that song. They said, "We'll be Yankee Doodles and proud of it." But that isn't the whole story. There is always more to war than winning or losing. These are words that were written in 1775. Isaac Davis was my husband. He was then 30 years of age. We had 4 children, the youngest about 15 months old. The alarm was given early in the morning, and my husband lost no time in making ready to go to Concord with his company. He said but little that morning. He seemed serious and thoughtful, but never seemed to hesitate. He only said, "Take good care of the children." In the afternoon, he was brought home a corpse.